All right, good evening, everybody. We are back in our First Samuel Bible study. Let's see if I get my slides going here. And this Bible study, I've been calling it The Book, God's Word is One Story Through One Family. And I just keep talking about how it's 66 books in this Bible, but it's really a library, yet a library that tells one story. Could you just imagine going to the local library and finding out that every book written by all these different authors told one cohesive story? You'd wonder if something was up, and it'd be something supernatural, and it would be. And that's exactly how the Bible is. And we're seeing it as we've been reading through book by book throughout the study. We're seeing how it's all cohesive, how God's through it all, and how it's all ordained and orchestrated by Him. So again, for anybody who's new to this, just to recap, we are in the history books. These are after the 5 books of Moses, Joshua through Esther. We are now in 1 Samuel, actually getting close to finishing up. We're in the last 3 chapters. We'll be in 29 tonight, and then we'll have 30 and 31, and then we'll be moving right into 2 Samuel. But remember that this was really one scroll, the scroll of Samuel, you call it, or the book of Samuel, and it's split nice and neat for us, and you'll see why, of course. And then it continues on here, but this is the history narrative, and remember that 1 Samuel is unique right now because before this, they're all judges, and Samuel's kind of the pivotal point here, where Samuel is the last judge and the first prophet, officially. And as we see that, we've been seeing that carried out throughout this story. Now, the book starts out, like I've been saying, it starts out with, of course, Hannah and Eli and Samuel being born. But now we have been into, basically, chapter 19 and on is really where we've been focusing a lot lately, is when Saul and David's saga really takes a turn, where Saul is going after David. David's fleeing him in his fugitive years. In chapter 21, just in a recap, I'll recap this again. David fled to Gath when Saul first, he threw that spear and he attempted, to murder, and David fled. The first thing he did is he went, remember, to the Philistines, the land of the Philistines, which is really strange because everybody knows David for killing the Philistines' champion, Goliath, right? So this is a really ironic take. And remember, he went in chapter 21 to Gath to see King Achish and all the people of Philistia. And he was worried when they started to figure out his identity. Because remember, I talked about, today we're kind of spoiled. We got social media. We have face identification cards. Back then, you didn't have any of that stuff. So they didn't know who he was. So David, remember, he played crazy. Pretended he was crazy because he was alone and was kind of afraid. So he went crazy, pretended to. And Achish was like, this can't be David. This guy is insane. And I have plenty of insane people here. He's a madman. Get him out of here, right? So, and the reason I bring this up is because this is the saga that we're going to kind of jump into again tonight that's continuing on. But this was his first trek where they didn't want him, and they said, isn't this, David, Saul has killed his thousands, David is 10,000, isn't this that guy? And David played the crazy man. And then, of course, directly after this was when he hid out in the cave because he was hiding out from Saul. He went to the land of the Philistines, and then he fled, went to the cave of Adullam, and this is where he got his band of brothers, right? He had 400 men. Later became 600 men then, right? And this is his army, and they weren't, they didn't come straight out of the military. They weren't Marines that he recruited, right, that were all put together. It was a bunch of ragtag people that didn't have experience, and directly after this, we saw about the city of Keilah in Philistia that they had to help out with. And remember, this is like their first battle. They were kind of afraid to go in it. But after they saved the city of Keilah, even though he wasn't king, Saul should have been doing this, David and his men saved Keilah, and now you can see how God orchestrated this so the men would have bravery, because this is their first real battle, and they did that. And then, of course, Saul pursued David after this, and I thought it was ironic, and I'm sure you guys did too, that David just was going and fighting the enemies of Israel, and his reward is to get attacked by the king of Israel. It's really bizarre, but it's showing how Saul is so tormented by this evil spirit and his own prideful sin. Sometimes you can't tell, is this demonic activity that we heard about earlier, or is this his flesh? It's probably both. A lot of times more probably his flesh, though. He's a prideful man. God had rejected him as king, and he was chasing down David. Remember, David spared him in the cave by cutting off the robe. And then we had the little David and Nabal conflict in the middle. We learned about how Abigail became his wife, that situation. And then Saul continued to pursue David, even though after the cave situation, he promised to stop and said, David, I know you're going to be king. I know about the prophecies. And he said he was going to let him go. But then, of course, showed how fickle he really is and turned his back on David, went after him again. And, of course, David could have killed him again, but spared him, had his, him and his men. He spared Saul there and told him all about it. And then after that, chapter 27, this is 2 chapters ago. We did 28 last week. But in chapter 27, he went back to the Philistines and Achish, like he did in chapter 21. This time it was different, though. He openly was okay with identity being known. And I talked about how it's probably different this time. Imagine if you walked into, a dark alley by yourself. You're going to be a little concerned. Whereas if you walked into a dark alley with 600 warriors that just, killed a bunch of guys and defeated the war, you're not as afraid anymore. Now you have your crew. So you can see this whole situation where he went to the Philistines. But it was really, this is maybe I said one of his worst chapters, right? Because David asked for a city there down in the outskirts. He plays it off. He's really suave and cunning. He's very manipulative, David is. He's smart, but he's also manipulative. And he manipulated Achish to give him a city, Ziklag, down on the border where he wouldn't be able to keep track of him, right? Going to live down on the southeast border. And when he was down there, David was lying to Achish saying, oh, yeah, I killed a bunch of Israelites for you. I killed a bunch of the Jews, right? But really, remember, he was killing all of their enemies. And then when he'd kill their enemies, he'd kill all the women and the children and the men. He'd kill everybody so they couldn't go back to Gath and tell Achish that he had actually been, making money off of helping Israel. He's actually essentially helping Israel at this point. But you can see how David has slipped in to sin here. He's starting to become... It's another good picture for us about worldliness, right? He just kind of slipping back into it. He's a little afraid. And why was David afraid? Because he was promised to be king. Saul said it. Now, Saul was chasing after David, but remember, he has survived 16 assassination attempts, essentially. And I know that would exhaust you, but you'd also see, hey, God has favor with my life. But it shows you that David, a man after God's own heart, even seeing God's providence, it still exhausted him because he was a human. He had stress and anxiety like we would, right? It wouldn't be, it's not exciting if, God gives you a really great thing, but all these awful things are happening. You can still become human and get worried. And I think that's why he got to be where he was. But when they got Ziklag, before David was fighting these wars as a valiant effort to wipe out the people that God talked about, here it seems that he's fighting more for a living, to make a living, for a job, to have food, treasures, animals. He's doing it maybe for the wrong reasons. There. But now the men are probably a lot happier because remember they were living in caves and always in the wilderness of Maon and Ziph being chased. And now they have their own walled city, most likely. It was most likely walled. That's what cities were back then. So they're kind of getting a little more comfortable, right? And you can see as that sometimes that'll happen. You can get a little bit more comfortable with things God doesn't want you to entertain. And even throughout this next chapter we're going to read tonight, you'll see more of this. So this is what happened. Remember, David and his men are now living in the Philistines' land. And it's just such a crazy twist when you realize Gath, is where a Goliath was also from. So it's really, really strange situation. And then here again was that map, just to know that everything we just talked about there is all going on down in the southern region of Israel here. This is the southeast and the southwest down there. En Gedi again was the caves he was hiding in. You can see Adullam was the cave where he got his men. So you can see where it took place all down there. Remember we went over that. And then last week and this week I got a new map out because now you can see Ziklag's still down there, all those down there, but now it's moved up north. And this is because the Philistines are now marching up north, which means they're going to launch an assault, an attack. It's kind of like an invasion that we saw, Russia invaded Ukraine. We see this all the time. There's these invasions. Israel's invading Gaza. Same kind of concept here, where Achish and the Philistines are up there because this was not their land. You can see down here, Ekron, Gath, Ashdod, Ashkelon, and Gaza. Those are the 5 cities of the Philistines. But you can see with these arrows here that they're making their march up north. So this is a planned attack here. And you can see from last chapter, remember, they went up to near Mount Gilboa. There's Endor and Shunem. Last week's Bible study happened in Endor there. So you can see we've now moved, just to let you know, the story has now migrated from down being in the wilderness down here in the south to now it's gone up to the north country. And that's where things are taking place because of this war is setting up according to the Philistines' attack. I remember last week we talked about this. Saul had saw the Philistine army and he was afraid, right? Because they were making this attack against him. And think about Saul. Saul in the back of his mind knows that he's been rejected as king and David's going to take over. So I'm sure there's this fear, just like you and I would have, of like, am I going to die today? Am I going to get captured? What's going to happen? And here come the Philistines. They're marching up into my territory. I have to go to war with them. I can't just write them off because they are coming into our land. So he freaks out. He doesn't know what to do, and he's asking God, and God didn't answer him. That's where his real panic came from. Because he did all the things, the Urim, the Thummim, the prophets, everything, and he's not getting any answers from God like he did before. And he's getting really, really concerned because remember, God already kind of pronounced judgment on him in a way that he's going to lose kingship. And then this is where one of the most strange stories of the Bible, one of my favorites, came out, is when Saul went to the medium at Endor, because they're up north now. And remember, he's like, hey, find me a medium, even though it talked about he got all these mediums, necromancers, the one that worked with the spirits and worked with the dead. He kicked them all out, which is a good thing because Saul's trying to follow the word of the Lord there, but then isn't it ironic? He immediately asks for one of these mediums that he kicked out and just happened to be in Endor, and which is just happened to be right around the town. It's kind of like I said, kind of like the black market. People that buy drugs always know how to find drugs in America, even though they're all legal. Did you notice that? And all they have to do is ask, hey, where can I find? And there's always a place. It just seems to be there's always a place. Same thing here. And right around the north, hey, they're up in Endor. There's a really good witch up there. You know, she could probably get in touch with a spirit if you wanted to. And he had it all happen, set it up. And remember, it worked. But Samuel came up, and some people debate, was that Samuel, was it a demon? I personally think it was Samuel. Could have been a demon. But she was so freaked out. There's something going wrong here. That's why I don't think it would have been a demon, because she was surprised, and she probably dealt with spirits, and this wasn't the one she dealt with. Or again, there's the other option that she's a fake and a phony, and she's been ripping people off, and now she's surprised that there's even a spirit here. One or the other, she was surprised, and this was not her doing, and she knew God was involved here. And Samuel, of course, came out, if it was Samuel, he came out and pronounced basically judgment, saying, why are you asking me? Why did you disturb me? Why are you asking me if God didn't answer you? Well, how am I going to help you is basically what Samuel's spirit essentially says, and that's kind of how it went there. Now we're in chapter 29, but before we do, let's go ahead. What we usually do here is read through verse by verse, but I just want to go back to the first two verses of chapter 28, because remember last week we read this, and I said it kind of starts out and then jumps, almost like a movie scene. We see a scene start for 2 verses, then we hop away, we went to the medium, and then we're going to hop back to that scene. So we're going to start back, and I just want to read the first 2 verses of 28, and then we're going to jump over to 29. So chapter 28, the first 2 verses said, in those days the Philistines gathered their forces for war to fight against Israel. And Achish said to David, understand that you and your men are to go out with me in the army. David said to Achish, very well, you shall know what your servant can do. And Achish said to David, very well, I will make you my bodyguard for life. So that's where it happened last week, and then we went into that whole Witch of Endor thing, right? And then we'll go to chapter 29, but you can see here, this is where the Philistines said they're about to launch that war that Saul was concerned about. And Achish and David have this conversation in the beginning of chapter 28, where Achish says, hey, you're going to go to war with me. I know you're a great warrior. You're coming to war. And David goes, sure, you know what I can do. Let's go. I'll show you what I can do. I can wipe out all these guys for you, basically. And he says, good, I'm going to make you my bodyguard for life, David. You're a great warrior, and I see you're a stench to your people. You've defected. You're going to be a really good Philistine. And that's kind of the establishment, which I talked about last week. It sets up the conundrum for tonight's chapter, because now we have David, who is marching in with the Philistines into Israel to fight against the Israelites. So his life has now completely flipped, and now he's in a predicament. And we're going to see how it all gets handled here. So chapter 29, we're going to read, I think we only have 11 verses tonight. We'll read those, and then we'll go ahead and break it down verse by verse. Now the Philistines had gathered all their forces at Aphek, and the Israelites were encamped by the spring that is in Jezreel. As the lords of the Philistines were passing on by hundreds and by thousands, and David and his men were passing on in the rear with Achish, the commanders of the Philistines said, what are these Hebrews doing here? And Achish said to the commanders of the Philistines, is this not David, the servant of Saul, king of Israel, who has been with me now for days and years? And since he deserted to me, I have found no fault in him to this day. But the commanders of the Philistines were angry with him. And the commanders of the Philistines said to him, send the man back, that he may return to the place to which you have assigned him. He shall not go down with us to battle, lest in the battle he become an adversary to us. For how could this fellow reconcile himself to his Lord? Would it not be with the heads of the men here? Is not this David, of whom they sing to one another in dances? Saul has struck down his thousands, and David his 10,000s. Then Achish called David and said to him, as the Lord lives, you have been honest. And to me it seems right that you should march out and in with me in the campaign. For I have found nothing wrong in you from the day of your coming to me to this day. Nevertheless, the lords do not approve of you. So go back now, and go peaceably, that you may not displease the lords of the Philistines. And David said to Achish, but what have I done? What have you found in your servant from the day I entered your service until now, that I may not go out and fight against the enemies of my lord the king? And Achish answered David and said, I know that you are as blameless in my sight as an angel of God. Nevertheless, the commanders of the Philistines have said, he shall not go up with us to the battle. Now then, rise early in the morning with the servants of your lord who came with you, and start early in the morning and depart as soon as you have light. So David set out with his men early in the morning to return to the land of the Philistines, but the Philistines went up to Jezreel. All right, interesting chapter here. So, here we go. Philistines get ready to go into war. We had that little conversation, David and Achish, and now we run into trouble. So, let's go start right at the back of the beginning. It said, now the Philistines had gathered all their forces at Aphek, and the Israelites were encamped by the spring that is in Jezreel. So, the first thing you can notice is at Aphek. Now, there's a couple different places called Aphek, but it's probably a little strong strategy point to make an attack. And if you would go all the way back to chapter 4, you don't have to here, but you can make a note of it. In 1 Samuel chapter 4, if you remember, the Philistines were in that too. And in that battle, they fought, and remember they stole the Ark of the Covenant? And Eli fell over dead. His 2 sons got killed over this whole thing, which is ironic about what's about to happen. When that happened, they attacked from Aphek, and it worked. So it's one of those things like, hey, remember when we attacked Israel and we were able to steal the Ark of the Covenant? Let's do it again. So I'd imagine there's a similar strategy going on here. And it's a good reminder to us too, because remember, the Philistines are the enemy. They're the literal enemy, but you can always take spiritual application too, as well from all this. And it goes to show you that the enemy, when the enemy can trip you up into temptations or get you into sin and it worked, it's probably going to happen again. You're probably going to be attacked in that way again. So it's something to look out for. And the Philistines had success before attacking from Aphek, and they do it here again while the Israelites are up in Jezreel. Remember, that's up north in the country. Then it said, as the lords of the Philistines were passing on by hundreds and by thousands, and David and his men were passing on in the rear with Achish, the commander of the Philistines said, what are these Hebrews doing here? And it goes on. So first off, you can see here by hundreds and by thousands. So this isn't just a little small army. They're marching in hundreds, they're marching in thousands. So you're getting, just by the language here, we're seeing why Saul was scared. When he looked out, he saw a marching army. They didn't just send a battalion. They're coming, with everybody here. And you see that David is in the rear with Achish. It's in the back. So that's where the kings will go. The kings aren't frontline men, right? Remember, David had Uriah sent out on the front lines because those are the ones who usually died. So David's now in the back because, remember, from chapter 28, what did Achish do? He made him his lifelong bodyguard, if you remember. So he's going to be the lifelong bodyguard. So David and his men are hanging in the back with Achish, and they're all marching into war. So they made the agreement. David and his men are going, and they're all marching until, and I'm sure it just didn't happen suddenly, like, hey, what's that guy doing here? I'm sure there were murmurs of it, like, hey. Now, first off, it talks about their commanders. So these are probably like the generals, the war generals. And these are probably the men that Achish counts on to win their battles. He's like his best managers. Kind of, if you're the CEO and you got really good managers, you want to make them happy, take care of them, because they're the ones that make your money. Same kind of thing here with the war. He's got his commanders, and the Philistines do well with these commanders. But I'm sure as they were marching here, they knew who David was already, because remember, he'd been living among them in Philistia. But I'm sure there was it always starts out like, oh, can you believe, what's David doing here? We can't go up there. And they're probably marching, and it's probably becoming such a big thing until the commanders, say, hey, we've got to talk. We've got to talk to Achish about this. What are these Hebrews doing here? And basically saying, what are these foreigners doing? And even worse, it's almost like could you imagine if America was getting ready to, I don't know, let's just say we're getting ready to go in, or let's just go with one going on right now, Ukraine and Russia. Let's say Ukraine is getting ready to make a counterattack or something on Russia, and there's a bunch of Russians that are now in the army for Ukraine. Ukraine would be a little worried, like, hey, weren't they generals in the Russian army? I'd be a little concerned too. So there's concern because these are Hebrews, and they're fighting the Hebrews, right? So naturally, these commanders, they're pretty wise men, right, in war. No, this is a liability. We're going to go fight the Israelites. And there are some Israelites here. What are they doing here? And Achish, you see his response. So Achish knows they're upset. And Achish said to the commanders, the generals, "Is this not David, the servant of Saul, king of Israel, who has been with me now for days and years? And since he deserted to me, I have found no fault in him to this day." So it's really interesting. He points out right there, David is the servant of Saul, the king of Israel, who they're actually going to fight. But he's using it in a good way. Like, isn't this this is David. This is the one that Saul hates. He's kind of saying that. This is the one, we're going to fight the king of Israel. Remember, the king of Israel has been chasing this guy because he's jealous of him, and David's not liked by the Israelites. And even worse, he's been now with me for days and years. Does anybody remember, without looking, does anybody remember how long David spent in Philistia up until this point? Yeah, go ahead.
Was it 18 months?
Very close, 16 months. So that was very close, 16 months. So a year and 4 months, essentially. So you get to know somebody, right? After living somebody a year and 4 months. And Achish says, listen, you know David. He's been living down in Ziklag. I gave him that. He's been with us for 16 months now. And he is as loyal to the Philistines as you can get. He's been one of my best guys. I actually just made him my bodyguard. We should really keep him around. Now, the problem with this is, again, like how bad, I just think of David's life here. David went from being this Israel warrior here and, taking out their champion to now he's in the Philistine army, literally in the army that he fought against. That would have been standing on the other side when Goliath is chanting. He's working with them now. Not only that, the king is defending to keep him here, saying he's one of the best Philistines we have. He's going to be great. He's a really great warrior. And it shows how much David has really fallen, right? Now you can make the argument and say, well, remember in chapter 27, Eric, he did actually attack Israelites' enemies, the Israelite enemy. He wasn't really attacking, and he wasn't really, but you could see David starting to backslide first when he even went to the land of the Philistines, when he went to Philistia. That was already lack of trust in God. And we can all say, we can't rip on David for that because we all might have ran too after trying to escape in the wilderness, 16 assassination attempts or whatever it was. So we can understand why he went there. But then he started to slip into, this killing and that war, the way he was doing it, probably not the right way. And remember, the best part is, he was lying to Achish. So now he's lying. And even though he was lying and he was protecting, he was doing it so he can help the Israelites in a way, he was still lying, and lying hardly gets you anywhere good, right? It never gets you anywhere good. So you could see how it has spun out of control. And the funny thing is, Achish thinks David's great. He has no idea David lied to him. He thinks David's awesome, and that's why he made him his bodyguard. But remember, David straight out lied to him time after time after time because it says, I went and defeated these guys, or I went and defeated these guys, and he was lying all the time. But now you have Achish, this king, defending him. And I just think it's a sign of David's fall, although it's sort of a fall. It's a backslide, not really a fall. He's really backslidden. And we're going to see, as we read throughout this chapter, that it just might be getting worse and worse. And it goes to show that when you start to sin, it is a slippery slope. At first he probably said, I'm just going to live in Philistia. I'm just going to live over here until Saul dies. And then it turns into, hey, we're only going to be here for a year or so. Let's just go build a wall down here and just stay here so we're safe. Then it turns into, hey, we just got to kill those people. And you can see how it starts to snowball and snowball and snowball. It's so bad now that he looks like a good Philistine. And would have probably broke David's heart, his younger heart, and his older self here. And it's kind of like, and I hope David saw it this way, but he didn't from what we read here. But it's almost a slap in the face, and David didn't really see it so much as such. Could you imagine being at your job? Just think of it like this. You're at work. And somebody says, I want to get them fired. It's a Christian. And I don't like Christians working here. I don't want any Christians here. I'm sick of this Jesus stuff. I want them out. And your boss came out and said, listen, they've been one of my best employees forever, and they have nothing to do with Jesus. They have nothing to do with him. They wouldn't even think about going into church. We need to keep this person here. Would you be like, cool, I get to keep my job? You might for a little bit, because you're like, hey, I almost lost my job. That was kind of scary. But then how awful would it be for somebody to say, oh, no, they're not a Christian. No, they don't believe in God. Trust me, I've known them for over a year now. I've seen no signs of it. That's a bad thing, right? Because we're supposed to look different than the world. We should be, the one thing is if you want to know if you're living vocally enough for God, it's like, could the courts of the United States, if Christianity became illegal today, would you be convicted and thrown in jail, right? And we all should have some convictions and be able to be thrown in jail if they were coming out and getting all Christians that had a record of doing Christian things, right? It's that kind of a concept. But when the world starts to think that you look like the world and not like Christ, and if you ever hear somebody say like, oh, trust me, they're not one of those churchy people, about when they say that stuff about you, it's a bad sign, and you need to say, wow, where have I been slipping up where this person thinks I'm not who I am, right? So you can see here that David has now been identified as a Philistine, which shows you just how far he's come. He said, I have found no fault in him to this day, but the commanders of the Philistines were angry with him. And the commanders of the Philistines said to him, send the man back, that he may return to the place to which you have assigned him. He shall not go down with us to battle, lest in the battle he become an adversary to us. For how could this fellow reconcile himself to his Lord? Would it not be with the heads of the men here? Is not this David of whom they sing to one another in dances? Saul struck down his thousands, and David his 10,000s. So they actually get mad with the king here. And I can imagine it's a pretty heated argument. David's, David's probably not maybe standing and watching this all happen, but they're having a heated argument here with the King Achish, right? Who technically could have them all killed as a king, right? But these are his trusted commanders, and they are angry with him. They say, you got to send him back. Get him out of here. We don't want this guy around. He is not a Philistine. And I know he worships that other god, Yahweh. But here you have Achish saying, no, Yahweh's not a problem. He doesn't care about Yahweh. You got to trust me. But they know who this guy is. And what's interesting is that I always talk about patterns and repeating. See in verse 5 where it says, is not this David of whom they sing to one another in dances? Saul has struck down his thousands, and David his 10,000s. Go back to chapter 21. Just flip back a couple pages. I think it's chapter 21 here. And let's read verse 11. I'm going to read chapter 21, verse 11, which is 8 chapters ago. And it says, and the servants of Achish said to him, is not this David the king of the land? Did they not sing to one another of him in dances? Saul has struck down his thousands, and David his 10,000s. So, you can see this is a repeated pattern that has happened. They very much know who this guy is. Not only that, they saw this song as prophetic. They saw, David is going to kill more and more. To get 10,000 of us, he's going to kill more and more of us. And they're going around chanting, and this thing comes back. Achish's men are always actually kind of keeping him honest. You can see Achish is actually kind of a foolish king, right? Makes sense because he doesn't follow the true God. So the other gods lead him wherever. Who knows? But they always try to talk sense into Achish. The first time that we just read about, that's why David started to act crazy, because they started to catch on. They knew who he was, and they knew when to kill. And now, of course, the commanders are like, no, this is that guy. This is that guy we talked about before, back in chapter 21. This is the guy. We're not letting it happen. And honestly, it was probably they were probably right. You actually got to say their commanders are wise, because no matter what, even if somebody defects, I would always be concerned. Concerned like, what if this thing gets bad? We can't just stop and send them back in the middle of war. This could be really detrimental to all of us. So in verse 6 says, then Achish called David and said to him, as the Lord lives, you have been honest, and to me it seems right that you should march out and in with me in the campaign. For I have found nothing wrong in you from this day of your coming to me to this day. Nevertheless, the lords do not approve of you. So go back now and go peaceably, that you may not displease the lords of the Philistines. So you see here, what's really interesting is how Achish starts this. So remember, Achish first defended David and said, there's no way David's a godly man from Israel that's going to do whatever. But then you see Achish use this language, as the Lord lives, which is a reference to Yahweh. You have been honest, and to me it seems right that you should be with me. I've found nothing wrong with you. Nevertheless, lords do not approve of you. So we have to ask ourselves, why did Achish say that? Because I don't think Achish was a godly king and followed Yahweh. But I think he knew that David did, right? He knew David did. So there's two arguments you can make. One argument is that he was trying to be honoring to David. Saying, hey, I know David's, deep down is Israelite. I know he loves his God. So I'm going to talk to him in those terms. There's a chance that could happen. Although, remember, he doesn't think David's much of a godly man. So there's a chance it's that. Or this is the Lord speaking through Achish without Achish knowing it. And saying, as the Lord lives, you have been honest. And almost as a signal to David, hey, these are my words, David. This is me talking now, David. You need to go home, David. Go home, David. You know what I mean? I think it's but we don't know. And some of these things we just have to sort out and just kind of, it doesn't matter. It's the science of it all. Why did it all happen? I don't know, but it all happened. But my take is that this was God's intervention, this whole situation. Because does God want David fighting against Israel? Absolutely not, right? Absolutely not. And David is pretty much signed up for this. So he's getting these words from the Lord, whether, Achish knows it or not. The Lord is telling David to go home, and it says, as the Lord lives, which is so much of a vow there. And also, so you don't displease the lords of the Philistines. And then it says, and David said to Achish, but what have I done? What have you found in your servant from the day I entered your service until now, that I may not go and fight against the enemies of my lord, the king? So what an interesting response. First off, he's like, hey, David, go home and do it nice and peaceably. We're not going to bother. I don't want you to displease and upset the Philistine commanders. And David's upset and going, why? Why do I have to go home? What did I do? What did I do wrong? And it just sounds strange. Could you imagine, somebody having you do a task that you'd hate to do, you wouldn't do, it's not even in you, and they say, hey, you're off the hook, and you go, wait, why? Why? It shows that he had somewhat of a desire here, and now you can play it again two ways. You can take David's side here and say, well, David's just really good manipulator. Remember how manipulative David is? He's really good. So he's going, oh, no, please don't send me home. Winking to his guys, just playing it out, playing the whole thing really, method acting this out theatrically. You could say that, or you could say David has lost his mind. David is so far gone, he has now slipped into worldliness, into sin, and he is so far in that he was actually willing to go and fight the Israelites. And fight, and who knows? Maybe he thought, maybe I'm supposed to kill Saul this way. Maybe I'm supposed to go up in this war and Saul dies. I don't know. But it seems like David wanted to, because David could have just said, all right, I'll go home. Well, guys, pack it up. But he seems to make this case like, hey, what have I done wrong? Because what if Achish would have said, hey, you know what, you're right. You haven't done anything wrong, and I am the king. Hey, guys, he's staying, right? That could have happened. That would have been a risk to David. And maybe David knew it wasn't going to happen. I don't know, but it just seems to me that David has been really messed up since he left and went to the Philistines back, when he did, and went to live with them. He's been living in sin, and he's just not the same guy. Not only that, think about David. When he killed, the Philistine leader, Goliath, he was totally fine with, messing up the Philistine commanders. What would he care? His actually number one goal was to displease them, right? But now here he is trying to please the Philistines. He's like, hey, we don't want to displease you. We don't displease them this way. And he's going to go along with it. And you can imagine, why isn't David just, being himself and being okay with being against Philistines and just saying, you know what, I'm defecting back to Israel. I don't know why I left. This would have been David's moment, by the way, other than the fact that his family's down in Ziklag, which will come up later. Otherwise, if his family, he should have just said, hey, we're up in Israel now. Might as well stay here, because how crazy is it that David is now living in Israel, or living in Philistia, and traveling to Israel as a foreigner. He could have went back, and this would have been the time for him just to stay there and said, I don't know why I'm running, this is crazy. And he could have actually defected and helped Saul fight the Philistine army right here. But he didn't. And then it continues on, says, so David said, but what have I done? And Achish answered David and said, I know that you are as blameless in my sight as an angel of God. Nevertheless, the commanders of the Philistines have said, he shall not go up with us to the battle. Now then, rise early in the morning with the servants of your Lord who came with you, and start early in the morning and depart as soon as you have light. So David set out with his men early in the morning to return to the land of the Philistines. But the Philistines went up to Jezreel. So again, you see Achish, after David says, what did I do wrong? Achish comes back again, and now he's talking. He's like, hey, you're as blameless in my sight as an angel of God. He's using this terminology that would be endearing to an Israelite like David. So again, you're seeing this language, almost like this godly language. This is why my own take, doesn't mean it's absolutely right, my own take is that God is speaking through Achish, saying, David, just get out of here. Go, this is me, it's me talking to you. You need to go home, David. I think that's really is what's happening here. It says, nevertheless, the commanders of the Philistines have said, he shall not go up with us to the battle. So he's saying, hey, David, I'd let you stay if I could. I'd actually love you to. That's why I made you my bodyguard. I'd love for you to go in here, because I think you could kill Saul and give us a really good upper hand here. But my Philistine commanders, who are my guys, I'm going to need them in this battle. They don't want you here. So just go home, David. And what's really interesting, I think about David now too, and this is another kind of lesson to us that can happen when we start to fear things like David did and let our anxieties and stuff get to us and start slipping into sin. Things can get really bad, because he was so, let's just say this, he was so much like the Philistines that the Israelites, he wouldn't have fit in Israel. Israel wouldn't have wanted him. He looked like a Philistine here. And he didn't feel welcome in Israel. That's why he ran, right? So he didn't feel welcome in Israel. He didn't feel home there. But now here he is. He doesn't feel safe in Philistia either because he's too much like an Israelite for them. So he's kind of like, I don't fit in Israel. Saul doesn't want me. I don't feel home here. But now I don't feel home with the Philistines here. And it's almost kind of like he's like the... He's not salty enough. He's not salty. He's lost his flavor. He's not an Israelite. He's not fighting out here for God, but he's not completely worldly. He's kind of one of those people in the middle. And you can see there's people even today like that who are believers, who are not really living, that they feel like they don't belong in church, even though every sinner belongs in church, no matter how far gone you are, right? We all belong there. But they might not be living so much for God where they don't really look like a Christian so much in their living. Yet at the same time, they don't fit in over here because they know they're really not of the world. So when they go and do their secular things, you get involved in the secular world, you start to feel like an outsider at some point when something comes up. And you're like, oh, I don't really do that. Oh, what do you mean you don't do that? And you can see how David is being wishy-washy, right? He's being wishy-washy. He doesn't fit in with Israel. Well, he could, but Saul's after him. And he's not having enough faith in God where he could have actually stayed in Israel and not been killed. Because God's word always comes to pass. And he told David he's going to be king. Might not have been fun, but he could have stayed there. But now he's gone so far over that he's worldly, but also not, godly enough. And David's life is quite a mess right now. And as we get into the next chapter, you'll see how David's going to pay even more of the price. How this battle here, him marching up the Philistines, doing all this, causes more issues later when we get to the next chapter about what happened at Ziklag while he was gone. So you can just see how this sin spirals out of control. And again, it's another lesson that I keep talking about, is that when we choose to sin, almost always it affects other people. And when it doesn't even affect other people, it can also include other people. So think again about these 600 men. These 600 men who were in the caves of Adullam, fleeing Saul, and they were defending David. They were fighting Keilah. They probably thought, we're gonna be with the king of Israel. We're gonna be in Israel's courts one day, and we'll be as mighty warriors. And because they followed David even into his sin, they all now live in Philistia. They all live in enemy turf, and now they're marching out into war. And they were gonna, if God wouldn't have stopped this, David and those men would have had to kill other Israelites. It just would have almost been inevitable unless David defected. Which, by his question to Achish, he might have been so far deep that he might have done something irrational. Because sin, like I said, can slowly numb your mind, and you can keep going steps further and further in. But no matter what, if David was in his right mind, David's just showing a guy that's not really stable at the moment. And because of that, he led a bunch of men into sin as well. So we have to be careful when we think about things, when we get caught up in our own fears, our own anxieties, and we want to make things comfortable, because I bet it was a lot more comfortable in Ziklag and living with Achish and all those people in the Philistia than it was living in the caves, right? And running from Saul. I bet it was a lot more comfortable. But when you do these things and you go against God and what he's commanded you to do, and you do things that you know are wrong, it's going to not only affect you, but affect other people around you, especially if people think that you're the godly person. Like, well, if they're godly, just like they thought David's godly, and I saw him fight, I'll go wherever he goes. You got to be careful about this, because our sins can either lead people into sin or affect other people, right? So that's chapter 29. Does anybody have any comments or questions regarding that chapter or anything that we mentioned about 1 Samuel here? Yeah, Beard.
I should have raised a question earlier. So when David is campaigning from Ziklag into these regions, are they not the people that God said go and utterly destroy these people? Is not he actually just doing what Joshua was supposed to do decades earlier?
Yeah, so that's the argument you make. And so there was still a positive side to when David was doing those killings. He technically was... he was technically following through by wiping out these people. So you can make the argument that, that was technically a godly thing that he did there. Just like, he went in and killed people at Keilah. That was a godly thing he kind of got involved in. However, once you start to see how it wasn't really commanded by God. And in all the other times it was, Lord, should I go in or should I not go in? And he would go to them and God would give the command. The fact that he never asked God, should I go in and do this, was his first sin. Because even Joshua, remember, Joshua thought he was doing a good thing in Joshua chapter 9 when the Gibeonites came. Remember, the Gibeonites played a prank. For you guys who don't remember this, in Joshua chapter 9, God says, don't let any of your neighbors here, don't let them in. And they all put ragtag clothes on, make it look like they came from a long journey. And Joshua, compassionate guy, says, oh, you know what, let's let them live here. And that was actually a wrong thing because Joshua just didn't pray. So even good things, that could be the right things, aren't if not going to in prayer. And the reason I think it could be even worse is because you even see that line in there that he was killing people so the word didn't get out. And I know why, you could say, well, he was trying to keep his people safe so they could stay in Ziklag. But when you're starting to kill women so they don't tell, it's starting to sound very sinful again. But you can make the argument, at least he wasn't killing who he told Akish he was killing. Because that would have been a blatant violation of killing Israelites, right? But Beard, you do make a good point that those groups that he was wiping out were ones that Joshua left around in Canaan there. That's a great point. Any other comments or questions or thoughts on anything? All right. Well, thank you, everybody, again for coming out. Next week, we have the church picnic, so we will not have service in the evening, but we will be back. I think it's the 25th, and we'll be doing chapter 30, so go read ahead. We're going to find out about what happened, why David and the men were gone after Akish sent them back. So go ahead and read ahead, chapter 30. While you're out, you can read chapter 31 because we're almost done with the book. And hopefully we'll see you then. So have a great rest of your week, and we'll see you next time.